Welcome back to Spotlight. I'm Al Gurnov, and just a reminder that my guest in the studio today is Mr. Martin Gilman, the former senior resident representative of the International Monetary Fund in Moscow and professor of the Higher School of Economics. Martin, during the break, you just mentioned that the fun thing would be to try to understand what the leaders could do with that summit they're holding today in China, the BRICS countries. What's fun about it? What could they do with it?
I'm being a bit provocative in talking about that particular group of leaders having fun together. But if they're going to go all the way to Hainan Island, why not? They've got nice beaches. The point, though, is that they've got a formal agenda which is pretty boring, okay? The pretty anodyne issues of international trade and poor countries' development and better coordination with the G20. However, these countries, as diverse as they are, do face a common threat. But right now they face this common threat individually, and the threat is called inflation. You know, in Russia, in the first quarter of the year, inflation exceeded 9% at an annual. In China, the preliminary estimates are that inflation in the first quarter of the year exceeded 6%, which for the Chinese is a very dangerous signal. In India, Brazil, they have the same, South Africa, the same inflation problems. These are not just domestically created. In Russia, there was a particular instance where the budget at the end of last year was too expansive, but basically the inflation is because there's too much liquidity in the world economy. Where does it come from? The Federal Reserve, advanced countries that are trying to prop up their economies. But because the investment possibilities are poor, the money comes to the emerging market countries and drives inflation. So this inflation problem is a threat. And believe me, all 5 of these leaders meeting in China are going to have very clearly in mind what happened in North Africa and in the Middle East with food and oil prices.
Listen, speaking of BRICS, so now that they added an S, it's no longer a BRIC, and some people are once again talking about taking the R out of this word. Well, I mean, saying Russia doesn't really belong. Do you? You're a skeptic. You're a pessimist. Do you? And you teach in Moscow, in the Moscow High School of Economics. Are there grounds to question Russia's position inside this BRICS organization?
First of all, I don't think BRICS is really an organization. It's just a grouping, and it happens to be a grouping that is just the ranking of countries after the G7 in terms of global economic power. Well, whether these Russia skeptics like it or not, Russia is still there, and whether you use purchasing power adjusted GDP or whether you use dollar exchange rates, the Russian economy is still, at the end of 2010, is still, depending on which data set you look at, the 8th or the 9th largest economy in the world. So it's clearly part of this group.
People criticizing Russia say that the Russian government is too much involved in the economy. But if we look at China...
I was going to say. I mean, it's a tough comparison. Once again, if you're looking through the lens of the Washington consensus, one might be very critical. In fact, one might be very critical of all these countries. In India, basically, the banking system is completely controlled by the state. Completely. So you have countries where the role of government is much more integral to the economy than one normally would associate with North America or Europe.
In India, they even change heads of private banks. I mean,
right. Good point.
The Nobel Prize winners, they say, you're not going to be the head of your bank anymore. Why? Because we said so. That's it. Anyway.
Right.
Okay, now, another point that really worries many people, and it does worry me too, is corruption in Russia. Well, here I think we are one of the champions. I mean, the Russian economy is one of the champions in corruption. So this does matter, does it? In terms of economy, in terms of growth, in terms of competitiveness, investment opportunities.
Well, certainly corruption is part of the matrix of problems that is causing the country to be trapped in this raw material producer impasse that it's in, and not be able to go beyond that. After all, basically, the Russian economy has a per capita GDP of about roughly $15,000 per capita. And you've had countries in the 20th century that have come up against that level and they bounce up and then they go back down. Argentina, Venezuela. And so the real challenge for Russia is whether Russia is going to just be bumping up against this limit because of problems of corruption, or whether, like Korea, remember Korea was very poor 40 years ago, whether Russia can, like Korea, can move beyond that 15,000 kind of barrier and become a much more normally functioning economy where rule of law and corruption are normalized with other countries. It's possible. Listen, there are countries like Italy, which after World War II were very corrupt. Dynamic private sector, but very corrupt political class and with the mafia. The Italians have come a very long way in cleaning it up. And so I'm relatively optimistic, or let's say skeptically optimistic, that if the Italians could do it, if the Koreans could do it with their chaebol and everything, the dominant groups, the Japanese with the zaibitsu and the conglomerates and back payments to politicians. If they could do it, why shouldn't the Russians be able to do it? But I don't know what the key is to solving this problem, but I certainly hear the right kinds of words coming out of the Kremlin on this.
When we were talking about overcoming the crisis, you said, well, Russia is doing much better now. Many people say that Russia was one of the worst hit by the crisis, despite this airbag of money that we're proud of. Yeah. Well, what was the reason that Russia was so much hit by this crisis?
I think there's a simple explanation, but and Alexander, you're absolutely right. Russia was hit worse than almost all the other countries, and the reason is because you Russians basically don't have very much trust in your own economy and your government. Mm-hmm. So that what happens is when the crisis started, money just started flowing out of the country. And not just foreign investors saying, I want to get my money out, Russia's very risky all of a sudden, but Russian investors taking their money out or not putting their money back in. So that they weren't just taking it out of the banking system, saying, well, banks are looking a little bit shaky here. After all, that happened in Nigeria, that happened in South Africa, that happened in Brazil. Money goes out of the banking system. But in those countries, the money stayed in the country. In Russia, though, the money actually left the country.
Well, actually,
not for long. But
why? People who started taking away money were the foreigners. They were the first to say, "Oh, I think,
right.
Considering the situation, I better take my money away." We, the Russians, especially the businessmen, they are taught to look at the foreigners, to be taught by to follow the Moscow School of Economics, where you are proud to be teaching, is a part of the mechanism of teaching Russia from the West how to run the business. You should admit that. It's part. It's one of the little.
I admit it.
So we just followed the example of foreigners. They're taking the money away of Moscow, so we should go to Switzerland too. What's bad going to Switzerland?
There's nothing bad about it. And Alexander, the point though is that there's a really good reason that this happened. It wasn't because that's what we teach at the Higher School of Economics, but because in Russia, unlike in Brazil, unlike China, unlike India, in Russia, you could take your money out of the country. Mm-hmm. In those other countries, they have capital controls. They won't let you. It's illegal. In Russia, since 2006, June 2006, you have complete convertibility of the ruble. And there's a good historical reason for that, because you had a terrible social experiment for 74 years under Bolshevik communism in this country. And so once you get rid of controls, any hint of reimposing any control, like the Brazilians have done.
The commies are coming back.
Right, right. So you can't do it. You don't have. You're caught between a rock and a hard place here, because you have to keep the economy completely open.
Liberal.
But there's no emerging market economy in the world that is as open as the Russian economy. So it means.
Can we make it an advantage? Can we make it use it as an advantage?
Of course.
Our over-liberalism, yeah?
Yes, given the fact that you, for historical reasons, you don't have much choice. Yes, you could turn it to an advantage. For instance, as your president would like Moscow to become an international financial center, or for the Russian ruble to become eventually a reserve currency. Well, one of the preconditions, but you just mentioned earlier corruption and a few others, but one of the preconditions for these type of developments, international financial center, international reserve currency, is complete convertibility of the currency. And so, yes, I mean, that's part of the building blocks.
Thank you very much. And just a reminder that my guest on the show today was Martin Gilman, the former senior resident representative of the IMF in Moscow and professor of the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. And that's it for now from all of us here. If you want to have your say on Spotlight or have someone in mind who you think I should interview next time, just drop me a line at algorithnov@rttv.ru, and let's keep Spotlight interactive. We'll be back with more first-hand comments on what's going on in and outside Russia. Until then, stay on RT and take care. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was fun.